Okay, so today we are going to read at least the first letter to the Thessalonians. I'd like to get through both letters to the Thessalonians today. There are two letters in the Bible addressed from Paul to the Thessalonians. They're short, and the second letter is shorter than the first. There are only 8 chapters total. 8 chapters, of course, in our organization, since the original letters didn't have chapters. So they're very short. However, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is one of the more difficult passages in all of Paul's teachings, if not even the entire New Testament. And so it's going to require kind of some special work, some special setup. So I don't know if we'll get to 2 Thessalonians today, but we will get to 1 Thessalonians. Okay, so the background to both of these letters is that, of course, they are written to the church in Thessalonica, which we read about Paul's visit there in Acts 17. Paul and Silas and Timothy, or Paul and Silas at least, went to Thessalonica after being kicked out of Philippi. Now, Paul will write a letter to the Philippian church eventually, but he doesn't write one there. He doesn't write one to that particular church for quite some time. There is a book in our Bible called Philippians, and so Paul will address a letter to that particular church at some point in time, but not yet. So they leave Philippi after having the experience of being beaten and imprisoned for a night, and of course the earthquake struck, and they got set free, or the walls came down. They saved the jailer and his family. The next day, they were publicly exonerated, and they left. That happened in Philippi, and then so they left from there. They went to Thessalonica, and they were only there for a short time. Paul only preached there apparently for 3 Sabbaths, so he could have been there anywhere from as few as 15 days to as many as 24 days or something like that. And it's hard to say. He wasn't there very long. He was only there for about a month, maybe less, maybe even only half a month. It's hard to say, really. Wasn't there very long. But he did have a lot of success there, and, of course, met a lot of opposition there. We read about that in Acts 17. Oh, no. Here comes the cat. You know, I think my cat, especially this skinny one, who always hops up here whenever I do this, she must hear the sound of my... I try to do this so that I'm doing these videos when she's taking her nap. But she must hear the sound of my voice, and here she is. And that just draws her out, and here she is again. Has to bother me now. And so in Thessalonica, in Acts chapter 17, verse 4, it says, some of the Jews are persuaded. He went to the synagogue, preached there for 3 weeks. He said, some of the Jews are persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks. So Greeks who were attracted to the Jewish religion and the Jewish way of life, but who had not become full Jews, and not a few prominent women, but the Jews were jealous. So the rest of the Jews who did not believe became jealous, and they rounded up some bad characters in the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They went to the house of the guy who was hosting Paul, Jason, looking for Paul and Silas. Didn't find them, I don't know where they were, and grabbed Jason instead, and then made Jason post bond. Probably, it's not stated, but probably this bond that Jason had to post involved some sort of guarantee that Paul would not return to the city. At least until the current city officials, the plutocrats or the magistrates, whoever they were no longer there. Paul does go back to Macedonia much later on, but whether or not he goes to Thessalonica is not specifically stated. But it seems as though there was some kind of a block or a hindrance keeping Paul from going back to Thessalonica, and it couldn't have been just normal travel, because he went from Thessalonica on down south to Athens and then to Corinth, and it doesn't seem as though he was prohibited in terms of the sheer logistics of getting there. Most likely, this bond that Jason had to post had something to do with ensuring that Paul would not return. Again, at least until the time of office for the current city officials was over. We don't know. We don't really know for sure, though. So anyway, Thessalonica, the church it had some Jews in it. He went to the synagogue. He converted some of the Jews, persuaded some of the Jews. But it seems to be ultimately, predominantly a Gentile church. As we read the letter to the Thessalonians, he's going to be referring to them, generally speaking, as having come from a pagan, idolatrous lifestyle, indicating that although there was a Jewish component to this congregation, it was predominantly not. And probably the Jewish components of the congregation would have been the leaders, because they would have been the ones who knew the Old Testament scriptures, and Paul had to persuade them that Jesus was a fulfillment of those scriptures. And that would have then put those people in a position to be the natural leaders and teachers of the church after Paul and Silas were removed, or had to leave. Or Paul did, at least. So the elders, like the leaders of that congregation, probably were the Jews, the Jewish portion of the congregation, but it seems to have been mainly a Gentile church. They had, and this is actually a pretty key aspect of understanding both of these letters, because the major doctrinal issue, most of the Thessalonian letters, there's 8 chapters total, and there's 5 in book 1, 3 chapters in 2 Thessalonians. So there's 8 total chapters, as we have numbered the chapters, to the Thessalonian churches. And the majority of the content of these letters, at least half of it, at least 4 of these 8 chapters, is basically just devoted to relational stuff. Paul is talking to the church about himself and about them and about their fondness for each other and about their history with each other and all that. And that occupies the majority of the space in these letters put together. The major doctrinal issue that is covered in the remaining space of these letters involves the day of the Lord, the coming of the Son of Man. That's the major doctrinal issue that is covered in these 2 letters. And this is important because it relates to whatever Jesus was talking about when he taught his disciples about the coming of the Son of Man and the destruction of the temple, as we read about in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21. And Paul is picking that up and talking about that. And the Gentiles in the Thessalonian church, the Gentiles in this region of the world, would have had nothing like this in their background, preparing them for this kind of concept. Okay? And the idea of resurrecting from the dead. And we'll see a problem with this in the Corinthians letter too. Paul is in Corinth, as he's probably, most likely in Corinth. He doesn't specifically say that, but he is, based on this timeline, as we read about it in Acts, it seems as though Paul is in Corinth as he's writing the letter to the Thessalonians. And when he writes his eventual letter to the Corinthians too, he's going to have to address issues there as well about this idea of the resurrection of the dead, because the Gentile world of that era and time would have had no frame of reference for such a teaching. They did have some idea, at least some branches of Greek and Roman thought at this point in time did allow for an afterlife concept, which was purely spiritual in nature. But the idea of physical bodies resurrecting and being reassembled somehow in some similar yet different state of being in a resurrection to be raised imperishable, to life everlasting, that would have been nowhere in their background. They would have had that's why when you read in Acts 17, when Paul goes to Athens, those people there have no idea what he's talking about. They think he's talking about introducing a new god, Jesus, and his goddess, resurrection. I didn't mention this when I was covering Acts 17, but when the Athenians hear him talking about Jesus and the resurrection, they hear it about him talking about a new god, Jesus, and his lady goddess consort, resurrection. That's how they interpret. That's how they see the world. That's how they see their gods and goddesses. Their gods have their lady goddess consorts. And that's the way the world framed itself, dating back to early Old Testament times. Baal of the Old Testament had his consort, Astaroth, or whoever. So that's how they understood things. So the idea of a resurrection being an event where the people who have died are resurrected to life and their bodies are somehow reassembled and restored to life, imperishable and everlasting, that would just have not existed anywhere in pagan thought at this point in time. So the churches that Paul is establishing in these Gentile communities, these pagan territories, had a hard time with that. The Corinthians did, as we'll read about when we read the letter of 1 Corinthians, and the Thessalonians did too. In both of the letters of Thessalonians, the major doctrinal issue covered in both of them is about this idea of the resurrection of the dead as part of the coming of the Son of Man. And because, again, this would have been nowhere in their background. And we will talk about this more when we get into 2 Thessalonians, because 2 Thessalonians has kind of more specifics, because they get confused about what it means for the coming of the Son of Man to be occurring or not. Well, we won't cover it too much, we will cover it in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, but there it's more specifically about the resurrection. And so we will save some of the background material for the intro to 2 Thessalonians. Anyway, so Paul left Thessalonica after only being there for a month or so. He went down to Athens alone. Silas and Timothy did not go with him. They went back to Thessalonica, at least for a while, to stabilize things there, at least to some degree. So Paul went alone to Athens. He was there. He spoke in the marketplace. He was brought to appear in front of the Areopagus. Then he left there, did not really establish a church. He persuaded some people, but he didn't really establish an assembly there. And then he left there and went on to Corinth, and that is where he stayed for a year and a half. And while he is there, Silas and Timothy come. He meets Aquila and Priscilla, so he has new friends. And they are both tent makers like he is, so they join in the trade. And then Silas and Timothy come to meet him. And he's pretty stable. For about a year and a half, he has something resembling stability. And remember, he hadn't really had stability now since he left Antioch. Okay? This goes back a ways. Because they did, remember, Paul and Barnabas made their trip around southern Turkey, what we call southern Turkey, the area that we've identified as the churches in Galatia, as referred to in Paul's letter to the Galatian churches. And then they do that, and they go back to Antioch, and they stay there for a while, and then trouble arises in the churches that they left behind, which is what leads to the letter written to the Galatian churches. And trouble also arises in Antioch and in Judea about how to deal with these new Gentiles coming to the church. So they go down to Jerusalem to hash it out, what's we call the Jerusalem Council. He goes back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas are together still at this point. Then they get the idea to go back to the churches they already went through, the southern Turkey, as we call it today, churches. But they split, and they agreed to do this, but they split. They disagree over John Mark, whether they should take him along or not. And Paul says no, Barnabas says yes. So Barnabas takes them and goes to the island of Cyprus, which is where they actually started on their first missionary journey some time ago. And Paul just goes on foot with Silas into the southern Turkey area, where he meets Timothy, or at least he probably actually met Timothy on his first journey through there, and then Timothy is old enough now to join him when they go through there again. And then they kind of meander around through the area that we would now call Turkey, not really having a destination in mind and not really knowing what they're doing, until they finally get a vision of Paul gets a vision of a man saying, "Come to Macedonia." So that's where they go, and Luke joins them along the way. And then in Macedonia, they go to Philippi, where they have a good time with the church they established there, but end up getting kicked out and leaving the town itself under very bad terms, although they have a very strong bond, or Paul does, with the Philippian church that is established there. Then he kind of goes into Thessalonica, where he gets chased out very quickly. Then he goes to Berea, where he doesn't stay very long either, because the Thessalonian Jews who opposed him at Thessalonica chase him to Berea. But he does establish a church there, one that apparently no longer needs instructions, because he never writes a letter to them. Then he goes on to Athens. Doesn't stay there very long. It's a very pagan city that doesn't respond too well to his message, and he gets out of there before he gets into too much trouble. Then he goes to Corinth. He actually does stay in Corinth about a year and a half. And that's probably where he is when he writes both these letters. Both these letters have Paul, Silas, and Timothy's names as at the beginning listed as the authors. So even though these were letters of Paul, this was somewhat of a group effort because Paul was speaking for all three of them. And it could even be that Silas, for example, may have actually written the letter as Paul was dictating it. We don't really hear about Silas again until he shows up in Peter's employ in the letter of 1 Peter, where he is apparently doing the same thing for Peter that he once did for Paul, and that he's writing down a letter as Peter is dictating it. So they're in Corinth together. They have a fairly stable situation there. Paul wants to know how the Thessalonians are doing, so he sends Timothy back to them to get a report. He's worried about them. He wasn't there very long. He only got to be with them for a few weeks, and he left under stressful circumstances. He's been prevented from going back. For some reason, somehow or another, he's been hindered from going back. So he has not been able to go back and check on their progress or their welfare, but he sends Timothy to do that. And so Timothy has gone there. I don't know how long he was there for, but he has gone there, and now he has come back to Paul and Silas, presumably in Corinth, with a very encouraging report about the Thessalonians. They are doing very well spiritually. They are enduring some kind of suffering, some kind of persecution. It's not really identified exactly what that means, but we'll talk about that maybe as we read 1 Thessalonians, trying to identify what the sources of pressure on them may have been. But despite that, they're holding up spiritually very well. They're a little confused on some issues, which is understandable because Paul didn't get to teach with them for very long. And Paul is very relieved and very greatly, very thankful, very grateful, I should say, that they are doing so well. So a large part of these letters is about him just gushing over this church. It seems to me that at this point in his ministry, this is about the year 51 or so AD. It seems to me that at this point in his ministry, Paul probably sees the Thessalonian church as like his crowning achievement so far. Because he wasn't there very long. He didn't get to speak to them for very much. And they've endured a lot of difficulties and during his presence there and afterwards. And yet they have survived, they've thrived, and they are in very good spiritual shape. Despite all of this, which can't really be said, for example, about the Galatian churches, which he was concerned about when he wrote that letter, that I don't know what's going to happen with you. I don't know what's to do with you. Or even the Corinthian church he's probably currently in, which we'll read about when we read the Corinthian letters, how messed up they were. So at this point in his life, at the year 51 or so AD, with 15 or so maybe years left of his life to go, he seems to see the Thessalonian church as kind of like his crowning achievement so far. Okay, so that's the background for 1 Thessalonians, and we will get into it now.